Alright, so here's the big fun theory video about Xenoblade 3 based on all of my prior knowledge of the series and the things we saw in the initial trailer. I think this is going to be a really fun one. There are a lot of wild things to talk about, and a lot of interesting connections to make as we discuss everything we really don't know, including the status of certain characters, where the Zohar is, and getting crazy with theories about the Gnosis and collective unconscious. Be sure to subscribe to the channel if you're excited for Xenoblade 3 because I will be covering everything up until the release and making a lot of gameplay guides and other videos after release as well. As you might expect, this video is going to have spoilers from Xenoblade 1 and 2, as well as some lore from Xenosaga and Xenogears, but I will make sure not to spoil any major part of the story of those. Just be warned, and let's get into it. Let's start off by talking about the world of Ionios more and take a look at a few things that were not in my previous video. I was told my pronunciation of Keves was wrong in the last video by like 20 people, so it is Keves, not Keeves, and I'll be referring to it as such from here on out. We have our two countries of Keves and Agnes, which seem to be at an unspecified point 100 to 200 years in the future, at least that's what I would guess based on Melia's age. It features the worlds of Xenoblade 1 and 2 combined, and how these worlds combined we have no idea. In Future Connected there doesn't seem to be any indication of this combination of worlds, and no character has ever mentioned anything like it. You'd think such a massive event would be highly talked about. We know from the ending of Xenoblade 2 that 1 and 2 end around roughly the same time, so it'd be very strange for 1 year after the fact the worlds had not combined yet since we see the Titans joining the landmass at the end of 2. This might suggest that some other force or factor led to this. Taking a look at Future Connected again, we know from Takahashi it was supposed to give some insight on the future of the series, which to me suggests that the Fog King and how it came to be in Xenoblade 1 world is very important. The Fog King seemed to come from a dimensional portal to a world he was not supposed to be in. One thing we know about the Zohar, or conduit, is that it is a gate that connects all universes, and the source of its power comes from gathering energy from the upper domain of existence above these infinite universes. The upper domain is a concept from Xenosaga, but based on the descriptions Klaus gives us, we can assume that in Xenoblade it works the exact same way. So essentially there exist infinite parallel universes in the lower domain. Klaus at the end of Xenoblade 2 says that when he opened the conduit and triggered his experiment, many people and things disappeared into distant dimensions, most likely these other universes. And we also know that Ontos, one of the cores of the Trinity processor like Logos and Numa, triggered a space-time transition event and disappeared. The other half of Klaus is of course Zanza, and Ontos is almost certainly Albus from the first Xenoblade game. From this, we know that Xenoblade 1 is a pocket dimension created as a result of the experiment within the original Xenoblade universe. With the disappearance of the Zohar, or conduit, we can assume this dimension becomes incredibly unstable having lost its power source, especially since Albus also disappeared and seemed to be the overarching control force of this pocket dimension that only consisted of an endless sea and two giant titans. To me, this would suggest that this instability is what allowed these dimensional rifts to begin appearing and allowed something like the Fog King to come in. This would also suggest this pocket dimension will increasingly grow more and more unstable until it cannot exist any longer without collapsing and combining with the main universe it was an offshoot from, in this case the universe of Xenoblade 2. This combining of worlds may have triggered a lot of chaos as objects and landmasses could have been conjoined or constructed on top of each other in random ways that could have drastically affected the entire foundation of the world. This could be why Raya is split in half if the Mechanosaur was transported back to the main universe right on top of the poor Titan, falling and splitting it in half before sinking into the ground again. Stuff like this could have potentially happened everywhere. For me, I think this is the most likely theory as to why the worlds have combined. So let's talk about the world of Xenoblade 2 for a minute. Klaus is originally a scientist from Earth. The conduit was discovered in Africa, similar to how the Zohar is discovered in Kenya in the Xenosaga games. This basically accelerates human technological development by providing a source of unlimited energy as a gate to other dimensions. Shortly after this discovery, a new unified world government created 3 massive space elevators, or beanstalks, and connected all of these with an orbital ring. One of these was the World Tree from Xenoblade 2, which goes all the way into space and the first low-orbit station, Ouroboros. The Trinity processor was then created as a way of protecting the orbital ring and the conduit, and was an artificial intelligence. That includes our lovely Aegises. Klaus eventually triggers his experiment, and we know the results of that. Afterward, he creates Allrest, a world essentially on top of the previous world, or Earth, and he constructs the Cloud Sea, Titans, and creates blades as a new method of restoring life and humanity. At the end of Xenoblade 2, The first low orbit station is destroyed by Numa, and the Cloud Sea and all of Alris seemingly disappears. Azurda and the party cross over a rift to an entirely new area, likely a different part of Earth that was not a part of Alris, or perhaps into a new world that Klaus even created, but most likely still connected to Earth in some way. This is important for later craziness. It is very much worth noting that we do not know where the other two space elevators are or what their status is. It's possible they could still exist as well somewhere on Earth, and that could have major implications for the plot also. But from all of this, what we can gather is that the world of Ionios likely exists on Earth far into the future. So let's back up and talk about the Fog King for a second. So the Fog King came from a different dimension, but the Fog King itself is interesting in the fact it seemingly could not be harmed with any weapons until Shulk was able to use a large amount of ether concentration to essentially materialize it into a form where it could be defeated. There are striking similarities with the Fog King here and the Gnosis and Xenosaga. The way to defeat it is almost the exact same way. The Gnosis are creatures that exist in an imaginary domain before being drawn into the real world with an ability known as the Hilbert effect, so they can be defeated, similar to the Fog King. This is a very popular theory and one I still believe myself, since the instability of the Xenoblade 1 pocket world could easily lend to a Gnosis-type invasion. Gnosis weren't always a problem in the Xenosaga universe. They only started appearing once humanity reached a super technologically advanced point, and the Zohar was being used to gather energy from other dimensions along with the use of the UMN, or Unus Mundus Network. This is a virtual network created that connects the entire universe and 500,000 planetary systems. The symbol of the UMN is a snake biting its own tail, also known as an Ouroboros. No one was sure how the UMN worked, but as it turned out, it uses the collective unconscious of humanity to power its infrastructure network. In this world, a human exists in two parts essentially. A physical body that exists in the real domain, and their consciousness, which exists in the imaginary domain, and this is also where the Gnosis reside. When a person dies, they lose their physical body, and their consciousness begins to get drawn into the collective unconscious. Gnosis are created when a human's consciousness rejects the collective unconscious and strongly desires to remain a separate entity. Since the UMN is using the collective unconscious as a power source to connect all of humanity and allow for hyperspace travel and communication all over the universe, that means sometimes Gnosis get out and become a major threat. It is also very much worth noting that if this collective unconsciousness gets eroded or even dissipates entirely, the entire universe could be destroyed. Universal instability can also cause this, as in Xenosaga the mass release of Gnosis is due to an event known as the Miltian Conflict, and to avoid spoilers, I won't go any further here. My point being here is that when Xenoblade 1 and 2 universes combine, this could have caused a massive warp in the universal fabric, if you will, and destabilized reality to a massive degree, and this easily could have led to an influx of Gnosis or Fog Kings seeping through the cracks, so to say, and lead to a major collapse of the collective unconscious in the Xenoblade universe. The overflow of fear and rejection of the collective unconscious would also be a huge problem, as it could lead to the universe suffering even more instability and being at risk for destruction. As more time passes, more and more consciousnesses will eventually reject the collective unconscious as well, which means the universe will eventually be destroyed if nothing is done. This is a big plot point behind the need for eternal recurrence in Xenosaga. So why is this important to Xenoblade 3? Well, as we know from the trailer, Noah mentions that the people of Ionios are fighting in order to live, and living to fight. Perhaps this great war is simply a way or method to keep reality from collapsing entirely. We know our two main characters, Noah and Mio, are both off-seers who mourn the dead. It also seems like when they do this, ether particles get returned somewhere, and this could be something to calm the soul or consciousness of the deceased person and force them to integrate within the collective unconscious to prevent reality from collapsing. They probably don't know this themselves, of course, but it definitely feels like a strong possibility. This could also tie in with the mention of clocks in the trailer and the marks that everyone in this world seems to have. People from both countries, so far seen on 5 of the 6 party members as well. Some of these marks do appear to be more red than other marks, and Unity does mention filling clocks, so it's possible this red in the mark is some method of doing that. I couldn't tell you exactly how this is connected to the collective unconscious, or how characters fill the clock, but it's possible there's some kind of system for people born into this world to be on some kind of life timer. If the clock runs out, perhaps they simply dissolve back into the collective unconscious as a way to keep the world going, and if I had to guess, perhaps killing is a way to fill the clock, as you contributed positively to this process as well. That sounds really dark, I know, but we do also know that Takahashi wanted to get darker in the next Xenoblade game, so this could definitely be what's going on here. Now, the terms may not align one-to-one with Xenosaga since the Zohar was renamed to the Conduit, but something similar absolutely could be happening. It might make sense then that the main party is trying to find a way to break this cycle and to save the universe, and considering there is a possibility this is part 6 of Perfect Works, this might actually tie in very well. After the ending of Xenosaga, people are looking to save their world from the very same cycle, and we learn that the key to that lies on Lost Jerusalem. And of course, then we never learn anything else because of the open ending, and then Xenoblade starts. And by the way, Lost Jerusalem is what the people in the far future in Xenosaga call Earth, a lost planet that they were originally from. Thus, I believe the world of Ionios is extremely destabilized, possibly suffering from a King or Gnosis-like threat, and perhaps trying to prevent their universe from collapsing. With that, fighting to live and living to fight makes a lot more sense, and the existence of off-seers would make more sense as well. If you're still with me after that massive lore dump, I want to talk about Ouroboros now. So one thing I did miss in the initial trailer before my first video because of my bad eyesight is how the weapons for the main party actually seem to have an Ouroboros symbol on them. It is very much worth noting that these were only half circles in the original fight scene between the characters before they joined up, and were different colors too. This could suggest that after joining, there is a sense of unity which completes the circle. This could have the implication that the main party is actually Ouroboros, and that Ouroboros isn't some higher threat controlling everything from the shadows. While I still do believe there's some force or entity doing that, it would be very interesting if the main party is Ouroboros, because that could actually suggest that Melia and Nia are going to be antagonists, at least in the beginning. Perhaps our main party hates how the world currently is and wants to find a solution, which is why Melia says Ouroboros abhors this world. And if Nia wants to eliminate them without a trace, then it seems like our party is in for a really fun time dealing with the two hostile nations that control everything, and it's even more messed up if Mio is actually related to Nia and Nia still wants to wipe her out. Regardless, Ouroboros possibly being the party, along with it being the main symbol for the UMN, may not be that much of a coincidence, and could suggest a lot. If I have any theory about where this could possibly lead, we know the Vandom lookalike mentions needing to go to Sword March, apparently it is called, to find the key to defeating the real enemy. The real enemy seems particularly important as a point of dialogue here, because that would eventually suggest someone is running things from the background, perhaps someone who knows about this cycle and is intentionally causing the war, believing he is protecting the universe. This might even be a character or characters from previous games, perhaps even a trio or trinity, if you will. But we'll get into that in a bit later. It could also be some higher entity like Udu or a wave existence that exists in the upper domain simply trying to protect the entire universe as well. Our two nations being different translation for the word lamb still suggest ultimately that they are being purposely put into this position for some reason. There are a lot of possibilities here, and I could be completely 100% wrong with all of this, but speculation is a big part of the fun. The name Noah here could be given its hidden meaning then, as it could end up being the savior of humanity after all. If this is part 6 of Perfect Works, then it might make sense as this is the final part of the trilogy, or at least of this part of the story. There's a lot of interesting plot implications here. Now, let's talk about possible returning characters. We know Melia and Nia are coming back, and are presumably leading their respective nations, but we don't know the status of anyone else. So the biggest question then, I'm sure that everyone is wondering above all others, is where the heck are Pyra and Mithra? Well, if you put any stock in the Xenoblade 2 line where Pyra says it might be nice to close her eyes forever with someone special by her side, maybe they're dead. But I 100% do not believe that. I think they are absolutely going to be in this game in some form. With that in mind, since they might be intertwined, I also believe Albus will be in this game. And since Pyra and Mithra are fully split now, or so it appears, it's possible one of them absorbed the power of Logos and the other Pneuma, and if that's the case, it would give our full Trinity processor with no Malos required. Of course, with reincarnation being a thing in the series and a Malos originally being an AI, along with him appearing to talk with Pneuma at the end of Xenoblade 2 when he is supposedly dead, it is entirely possible Malos somehow comes back in some way also. Regardless, I think in some way the full Trinity processor will be relevant to the game somehow. So what we supposedly know is that Alvis, or Antos, disappeared with the disappearance of the Conduit at the end of Xenoblade 1 and 2. However, there may be reason to believe the Conduit or Zohar is back in this game, which could mean his return. And he may have a physical body in the original universe again, but won't have control over everything like in his created pocket dimension. We'll talk about the Zohar later. I think Pyra and Mithra will have a pretty critical role in the story, and given the fact that I'm sure those two want to save humanity in themselves, and Albus is inherently neutral in his judgment and would likely side with what's best for the universe, it is entirely possible that they're the ones that put the world in this kind of state, maybe even leaving Nia in charge of Agnes themselves. Perhaps that is a dark thought, but perhaps they also believed it to be the only way given their original reason for creation and existence of protecting the Zohar at all costs. Albus in particular could be interesting and could have even been corrupted by Gnosis-like entities as he moved through universes with the Zohar, supposedly anyway, and that could also lead to some interesting implications. It's also possible that Pyra and Mithra are simply hiding out for now and refuse to be a part of everything going on and are maybe waiting for the group of heroes to seek them out and ask for help. Regardless of how they will be involved, I am almost certain that they will be involved somehow, and if this next character is potentially anything to go by, potentially an ally at some later point in the game. Let's talk about Poppi. Poppi, being an artificial blade who runs off an ether furnace, should in theory still be around in this game somewhere. Theoretically, she'd be on the Agnes side, but if she were in her cutie pie form, then Kevis would have already been annihilated, so maybe she's not a part of the war after all. The interesting thing to note about Poppi is the promise of Mithra in Chapter 8. One side of the bargain has already been fulfilled in one of the most heartbreaking scenes ever, but what if it just gets worse? Poppi was always worried about potentially being used as a weapon to destroy the world, and Mithra promised her that she would stop her if it ever came to that. Mithra didn't give her side at the time, but decided to cash in that promise at the end of the game in Xenoblade 2. What this could suggest is that Poppi could be reprogrammed as an enemy, and Mithra might have to fight her, along with potentially our new cast. I can imagine this scene wouldn't be any fun for anyone and might be a really morbid thought, but we absolutely cannot discount the possibility since Poppi did explicitly say this, and we know how Takahashi is with his planning. Hopefully Poppi is just fine and maybe deactivated somewhere, and we can get some cute side quests to help her and everything is all fine and dandy, but she could even join up. Just make sure you're prepared for the worst. So let's talk about Zeke and Rex then. Both were infused with part of the core crystal of their blades and thus should have longer lifespans than normal humans, but given that Pyra and Mithra are nowhere to be found, it would be hard to say if Rex is alive. I think it's actually more likely that he passed away from old age for one reason or another, similar to Shulk's, I'm sure, so both main characters won't be here in this game, since I doubt either of them would have wanted this or let this happen. Zeke, on the other hand, could still be alive, even if much older now. Perhaps he's the Vandam lookalite, as discussed in the previous video, or perhaps he's off on his own somewhere and too weak to fight these days. Pandoria was notably absent as well, so if Zeke is still alive, there's a possibility they're just hidden for now. I'm not sure what else to say about them besides that, so let's move on. Azurda is probably still alive. As a Titan, he has a very, very long lifespan, and if I had to guess where he is, I would guess that he's with Pyra and Mithra and helping them out in some way, whether they are the antagonistic force or just hiding out. We don't know for sure, but I would guess that Azurda would be with them if anything. Dromark! I know he's everyone's favorite character, and in theory he should absolutely still be around since Nia is still alive. In fact, I bet he's probably with her most of the time as usual, and we might even get evil Nia petting him Team Rocket style. I don't know if he'll have any kind of major role in the story, but I can see him being used as an attendant or fighting alongside Nia in a potential fight. On that note, I see Tyrea in kind of a similar vein where I'm sure she's alive and helping Melia out somehow, but I don't know enough to make any more predictions based on that. Speaking of which, a lot of Blades and Machina should still be around as well, along with the younger Hyentia from Xenoblade 1. They all have slower aging, so it makes sense for these people to still be alive. Blades are essentially immortal, but many might have lost their memories. It's entirely possible we come across a Brigid, a Gion, Rock, or even a rare Blade that wasn't part of the main story that has entirely lost their memories of our Xenoblade 2 party, and could be relevant in one way or another. The Machina are particularly interesting because we didn't really see them in the trailer at all, but they really should still be around in some way, perhaps contributing to Kevis technology. Hyentia might all be fiercely loyal to Melia, and former NPCs could return as enemy soldiers even. There's a lot of possibilities here as well. The final character I want to talk about is Cosmos. Now this might just be a pipe dream, but considering a lot of similarities between Saga and Blade I've theorized about today, along with how Saga 3 ended, there is a small possibility the real, canon Cosmos could be in this game. Her power level might be a bit beyond, or even far, far beyond anything we've seen in Xenoblade so far, but it could still be something around the end of the game. If Gnosis and dimensional rifts are a big plot point, and Earth, where Ionios is, could also be Lost Jerusalem, then the possibility cannot be discounted. I don't want to get too into this as it could quickly delve into spoiler territory, but I would definitely pop off really hard in Cosmos return in some way to help deal with some kind of Gnosis or Fog King threat, maybe even act as a catalyst to combine the nations against a larger enemy or force controlling everything in the background. Chaos could possibly also return too as well given his lore, but I'm not going to worry about that right now. Let's talk about the Zohar. As explained, the Zohar is a source of infinite energy that draws its energy from the upper domain in other universes by acting as a gate. And it is also called the conduit in Xenoblade 2, and it supposedly disappeared at the end of that game. Now this is a Xeno game, so it's definitely going to have some kind of involvement in this game somehow. As far as what we see in the trailer, this giant mech thing seems to have a Zohar shape near its center, likely where the power source is. And I mean the Xenosaga Zohar shape. Now I highly doubt this is the real Zohar, but it's very possible this could be some kind of emulator. Xenosaga had the concept of Zohar emulators that obviously were not anywhere near as powerful as the real thing, but they were able to emulate the wavelengths that allow them to take power from the original Zohar, kinda like a Zohar subsystem. This was an invention that ended up being surprisingly effective, and I would not at all be surprised that this happens in this game, especially with some of these larger mechanical enemies. It's possible these are some kind of guardians that neither nation can deal with properly and are being used by the third force, perhaps watching everything unfold. This shape is one of the most iconic symbols for the entire series. The Lifehold cores in X and the Aegis core crystals also have a similar shape. Cross-shape energy is everywhere. I would be shocked if the Zohar, or conduit, is not involved in this game somehow, and could even directly be being used to dictate everything going on and putting humanity on these timers. Regardless, Zohar shenanigans will occur and the story will get absolutely crazy with some insane powers at some point in this game, I can almost guarantee because of just what series this is. If there's anything else that's interesting to discuss, it would likely be what happened to all of the previous nation of these two worlds before they combined. Was the combination of worlds some massive disaster that wiped out almost everyone and the survivor created these two new countries? I've heard a different theory that one of the reasons for the war is the differing sides' view of Klaus. One of them wanted no gods in Xenoblade 1, and the other side may have saw the world gifted to them in his last breath, and thus believers of both sides joined together. I don't know if I subscribe to this theory being the real reason, but it could be the surface level reason for why all of this is happening and how the characters interpret it. We also know from Mio's line of fighting because there are enemies to kill, that it's likely all of these people have known is this war and fighting without ever questioning what they were doing. If most everyone was wiped out when the worlds combined, then it would make sense for new nations to form. But otherwise, could these nations have fallen? Maybe Moradin and Arayo individually were wiped out by some kind of war or just getting taken over by the enemy? Along with Alchemos, the Machina, even Colony 9? There's a lot to speculate about how the world ended up in this state, and I bet the game will show off a lot of the physical results of the worlds combining, which I think will be very interesting if the trailer is anything to go by. There's a lot to speculate about, but really more than anything, I'm just hoping we get a game that feels like Xeno, and even if this is the end of this particular arc, it may lead to a new arc that's even more crazy and wild. Perhaps we'll even get a physical arc for Noah to use at some point just to drive home that comparison even further. Hopefully in Xenoblade 3 we can find the real enemy and save the universe and stop this never-ending war. Perhaps there will be a way to keep the universe stable without relying on the collective unconscious, or perhaps there will be a new way to keep it stable by combining with other lower domain universes. There's no real way to know for sure at this moment in time, and maybe all of my theories are completely wrong and completely out there and off base. But regardless, I hope it's at least gave you something to speculate and think about. That's probably going to cover it for me in this video, so if you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and make sure to follow me on Twitter and Discord, which you can find in the description below. I'm not sure what the next video is going to be about, but hopefully it's going to be something interesting. With that being said, have a wonderful and blessed day everyone, and I will see you guys then.